The name of my blog is called View from Above, and you can find it at viewhigh.blogspot.com. And what I want to talk about today is this claim by Barack Obama that he inherited a $1.3 trillion deficit.
So let me start the discussion of government spending by setting the record straight. At the beginning of the last decade, the year 2000, America had a budget surplus of over $200 billion. By the time I took office, we had a one-year deficit of over $1 trillion and projected deficits of $8 trillion over the next decade. All this was before I walked in the door. As a result, when I first walked through the door, the deficit stood at $1.3 trillion, with projected deficits of $8 trillion over the next decade.
So, is that a legitimate claim? I don't know. We'll have to do some research. But it seems hard to believe that if the budget deficit for fiscal year 2009 ended at $1.4 trillion, that $1.3 trillion of that was committed before Barack Obama even walked through the door. Don't forget, the fiscal year ends September 30th. So from January 20th, when he walked in the door, until September 30th, Obama did do some spending.
As you can see from this graph, there was a $236.2 billion budget surplus during the last year of the Clinton administration. George W. Bush took office in 2001 during a recession. The recession was caused by Alan Greenspan, chairman of the Federal Reserve, who steadily hiked up interest rates. This resulted in the collapse of the dot-com bubble and a decline in tax revenues to the federal government. To counter the effects of the recession, George Bush passed the tax cut in 2001. Also that year, the attacks of 9/11 occurred. By the end of 2001, we were at war with the Taliban in Afghanistan. In response to the attacks of 9/11, Bush created the Department of Homeland Security and began the process of increasing security at America's airports and seaports. In 2003, George Bush invaded Iraq and passed the second tax cut. The tax cut succeeded in stimulating the economy, and from 2004 through 2007, the budget deficit actually declined due to increased tax revenues. In 2008, the economy began to slow and unemployment started to increase. George Bush passed an emergency stimulus bill. Housing prices continued their decline, which started in 2006 and 2007. Home foreclosures increased and a number of banks went insolvent. The budget deficit jumped to $455 billion, caused by a 15% decline in corporate tax receipts, a drop in revenue caused by the economic stimulus rebates, and increased spending to bail out a number of banks and financial institutions. So what went wrong in 2009? Why did the deficit increase 300% from $455 billion to $1.4 trillion? Well, one thing we know is that it was not for the reasons that President Obama likes to blame it on.
Most of this was the result of not paying for 2 wars, 2 tax cuts, and an expensive prescription drug program.
The deficit numbers we have just been reviewing include those 2 wars, the 2 tax cuts, and the prescription drug program. But those expenditures do not account for the tripling of the deficit that occurred in fiscal year 2009. The Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, says that the federal budget deficit for 2009 was created by a sharp decline in tax revenues at the same time that there was a dramatic increase in federal spending. Tax receipts dropped by $419 billion, or 17% from 2008. It was the largest annual percentage decline in revenues in more than 70 years. Therefore, it is fair to say that this portion of the deficit was not caused by any excessive spending during the Bush administration. The decline in tax revenue was caused by a recession. The recession, in turn, was caused by the collapse of a housing market bubble that was years in the making. Both Democrats and Republicans share responsibility for the housing crisis. On the other hand, federal spending rose by 18% in 2009, the fastest rate of growth since 1975. There were three main initiatives which drove the spending growth. There was the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, the bailouts of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and the Obama stimulus plan. This spending accounted for $353 billion in fiscal year 2009. When combined with the $419 billion shortfall in tax revenues, we can account for $772 billion, or more than half the total budget deficit. The remainder of federal spending increased by nearly 2% of GDP, or $280 billion, over spending levels for 2008. First, it should be noted that Democrats held a majority in both houses of Congress since 2006, and therefore they were responsible for all federal spending beginning in 2007. Second, it should be noted that on March 14, 2008, then Senator Obama voted in favor of the 2009 budget, which authorized $3.1 trillion in federal spending with a projected deficit of $400 billion. The 51 to 44 vote was primarily along party lines, with only 2 Republicans voting in favor. Third, it should be noted that when the final conference report on the budget was presented to the House on June 5th, not one Republican voted for it. Thus, the fiscal year 2009 budget was almost exclusively approved by Democrats, with yeas coming from Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Rahm Emanuel, and Hillary Clinton. As for TARP, on October 1st, 2008, Obama, Biden, and Clinton voted in favor of the $700 billion program. Not only did Obama support TARP, but even before he walked through the door, then President-elect Obama called on President Bush to release the second half of the TARP funds. As for the bailouts of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, then Senator Barack Obama favored the move, saying, "We have to take steps to make sure they don't just collapse." In February 2009, President Obama signed a $787 billion stimulus bill into law that was passed with just 3 Republican votes. According to Obama, if the bill was passed, then unemployment would not exceed 8%. During fiscal year 2009, there was a net job loss of approximately 5.25 million jobs, and unemployment exceeded 9%. Nearly 3 million of those jobs were lost after Obama signed the stimulus bill into law. Not only did those lost jobs result in reduced revenues, but in greater spending as well. Unemployment benefits in 2009 were more than 2.5 times the amount paid in 2008, an increase of $73 billion. That jump was exacerbated by increased benefits. Just weeks after signing the stimulus bill, Obama signed a $410 billion omnibus spending bill, which contained over 8,000 earmarks of pork-laden spending. Bottom line, President Obama did not inherit a $1.3 trillion deficit. He participated in creating it. He voted in favor of the 2009 budget. He voted in favor of TARP. He personally requested George Bush to release the second half of the TARP funds. He favored the bailouts of Fannie and Freddie. He passed the stimulus spending bill. He passed the pork-laden omnibus spending bill. He failed to stop unemployment from rising. He arbitrarily increased unemployment benefits. The total budget deficit for 2009 was $1.4 trillion. The difference between $1.4 and $1.3 trillion is $100 billion. Barack Obama's stimulus package alone spent $108 billion during fiscal year 2009. His omnibus spending bill, with 8,000 earmarks, added even more. Aside from the unbudgeted earmarks, the omnibus bill increased spending by an average of 8% over 2008 levels. President Obama's budget of $3.6 trillion for fiscal year 2010 was an increase of $500 billion over Bush's 2009 budget of $3.1 trillion. Clearly, President Obama has no real interest in deficit reduction.